This is Jonnie from Open Studio Patterns, and today I'm going to make this wing coat, but I'm going to make it collarless. This is an image of the original pattern that we made back in 2022. It has a notched collar, and this drawing here is what the collarless version will look like when it's finished. So first off, the pattern pieces you'll use from the original set of swing coat pattern pieces. The front coat, the back coat, the sleeve, the front facing, the back facing, and the pocket piece. You will not need the under collar or the upper collar. I made a free template for this collar variation. You can certainly recreate this without downloading the PDF template. It isn't anything too complicated, but I just thought that some people might like it to be more straightforward and would appreciate a guide. So if you want to, you can find the link to the free template in the description below. Here I am piecing all the pages together. The template will only be for the upper part of the coat because the collarless variation only affects the neckline. Now I'm cutting out all the pieces in my size, which is a size small, and I'm going to show you how to use all these pieces with the original swing coat pattern in just a little later in this video. If you don't already have the original swing coat sewing pattern, it is for sale on our website, and that is also linked below in the description. Before I demonstrate how to use the template, I wanted to share a little info about the materials I'm using for this look. This is a brushed cotton twill. It's probably about 2 to 5% stretch. There wasn't a lot of information with the fabric when I found it, but that's my guess. I wanted a color that would be versatile and could be worn with many things. I was thinking trench coat when I was searching for the self fabric, and I think this is a pretty great option. I will be binding the edges of the seams, so I'll use this cotton lawn fabric for that, as well as the pockets. Lawn is really lightweight and soft, which will work nicely with this lightweight coat. I have a couple options for threads, but I'll probably go with this lighter colored cream, and you'll see me test that out before I begin sewing. Knit tricot has become my go-to interfacing, so I'm just going to use it on the facings for this as well. And here are 3 20mm buttons. That's all for material, so next up let's talk tools. You need your measuring tape, a ruler, marking tool, pattern wheel, scissors for fabric, pins, snips, and something to turn out your corners, and a hand needle for your buttons. There are 2 ways to work with this template. First is probably the most organized way, which is tracing the original swing coat pattern, all the pieces that you'll be using for this look. And you can see me doing that here. I'm tracing all of the edges, the notches, I'll trace the dart, the grain line, the drill holes for the buttons, and the button holes. Most of the time I will preserve the original pattern for future uses. That way I won't have to reprint it if I want to use it again. I'm going through and making sure all of the darts and the grain line, the notches, and the button markings are all there. And I'm filling in all the information about the specific pattern piece. Go ahead and trace the back coat and the front facing, and we're just going to use the back facing from the template as is, no need to trace it. I'm demoing how to make this coat, but I'm also at the same time quality checking this template. So you'll notice here on the back facing, it says front coat. All of my pieces in the template say front coat, so I'll make sure to go back and edit that. Mark a notch on the front coat piece directly over from the button marking. You'll use this to align the template piece accurately. I aligned that notch as well as the shoulder point. Draw in the new neckline and center front. The curve along the neckline isn't drastically different from the original, but I did feel like the 3/8 inch was necessary to trim off during fitting. So you see the new neckline versus the original, and I'm marking out the original so I don't confuse myself during cutting. And I'm just drawing in the new center front, which is just a straight line all along the center front, and making sure that this point here is a right angle. Cut it out, and now I'm using a notcher on all the notches drawn on the pattern. You don't absolutely need this tool, but it's nice to use on all your patterns and makes it easy to mark notches for cutting. I repeated tracing and lining up the template on the back coat and front facing pieces, but I won't show it here in order to keep this video trimmed down. Instead, I'm just showing how the templates will line up with the original pieces. You line up the notches along the center back of the back coat, as well as the shoulder point. There isn't much that gets trimmed off the back neckline, but you do need to true it up so it blends nicely into the front neckline. The front facing gets lined up using the notch at the break, as well as the outer edge along the shoulder. And as I'm quality checking this template, I'm noticing that the template facing is slightly wider than the original facing piece, so I'll make sure to get that edited as well. You can see here again how the curve of the neckline changes and the center front becomes a straight line. Again, there's no need to trace the back facing, we're just going to use it as is from the template. This is the second and easiest way to use this template, which is just taping the template directly onto the original pattern. I have more than one copy of the swing coat pattern, so I don't mind if this copy gets altered forever. So what you're going to do is just line up the notches at the break and the shoulder point and just tape it on. Now just trim off any parts of the original pattern along the neckline and center front. And you're done. Repeat this on the back coat and front facing pieces, lining up the notches along the center back and shoulder point, and then trace the new neckline. Line up the notch at the break as well as the outer edge of the facing. Trim off anything from the original pattern along the center front and the neckline. Use the back facing piece from the template as is, no need to trace. I tested the pattern on a muslin and there are no real changes that need to be made, so I'm ready to start making the final coat. Now I'm going to get prepped for sewing this baby. I'm testing out my stitches before I sew anything. I'll use a 2.5 length for all the seams and a 3 length for any top stitching. Since I'm binding all my edges, I need to make a bunch of bias. We made a video years ago showing a really efficient way of making a lot of bias at once. You can find the link to that tutorial in the description below. I won't be showing all of the sewing for this piece since we've already made a full video for the swing coat, which is linked in the description below as well. But I really love how this facing comes together with a nice clean edge, and I just wanted to highlight it one more time. With right sides together, attach the back facing to the front facings for the self fabric and inner facing. Press the edges of the self fabric open, and with right sides together, line up the shoulder seams. You'll be stitching along the outer edge of the facings, which is the opposite edge of the neckline and center front edges. Start at one end of the facings and stitch all the way up along the edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You want to make sure that your inner facing is still lining up with the edge of the self fabric. Flip right side out and take the facing to an iron and carefully press the seam flat. But do not fuse the inner facing to your ironing board or to the iron itself. I know this is tricky, but it can be done. However you go about pressing the seam, you'll want this edge to be smooth and clean in the end. Here it is pressed nicely. Now you see why this is a nice alternative to finishing the edges with a serger or a zigzag stitch. The other nice alternative would be to bind the edges with bias, of course, but I just feel like this is a much faster and easier way of getting it done. Next, I'm attaching the facing to the front of the coat. I'm stitching 3/8 of an inch and pivoting at the corner of the hem, making sure that the needle lands 3/8 of an inch away from the center front edge. Stitch all the way up along the neckline. And now I'm at one of the right corners of the neckline and showing you here how I've already stitched along the back facing and how I pivoted at that opposite corner already. I'm in the process of pivoting in the opposite corner, and now I'm lining up the facing edges with the center front of the coat. I'll continue stitching down the center front and pivot again in the opposite corner of the hem. I'll end up trimming the seam allowance of the corner and flipping the hem right side out, and that corner will look nice and sharp. And this is how the hem will work alongside the facing. Now it's time for a lot of top stitching. I've pressed the last seam flat and flipped the facing to the inside of the coat. I'll top stitch along this outer edge 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I'll also stitch 1/8 of an inch along the facing edge, securing it to the coat. If you don't want this top stitching visible on the outside of the coat, skip this step. This is my personal preference as I really can't stand when a facing isn't anchored to a garment. But again, this is my personal preference, so you can make this decision for yourself. So here I go stitching the facing to the coat 1/8 of an inch along that finished edge, all the way up the front, along the back facing, and down the opposite front facing. Along the way, make sure you line up the shoulder seams, and there will be no buckling of the facing when it's finished. The facing needs to be completely flat against the coat bodice. I got all the way to the other side of the hem, and I'm making sure the back stitches are nice and neat. Next, I'm stitching the hem 1/8 of an inch along where the seam allowance has been turned under, and I'm starting that line right at the last stitch line I just made. This step for the hem is all in the swing coat instructions, so don't worry if it feels like I'm speeding through this part, but I pivot where the hem seam allowance meets the side vent seam allowance. That's all been pre-pressed and folded under. Again, it's all in the instructions. I stitch up the vent, then diagonal, creating a fun little angle, and pivot again at the side seam and make my way back to the opposite side of the vent, moving back down to the hem. Continue on with the rest of the hem and the second side vent, ending at the top stitching I made when I stitched down the facing. Now I'm moving on to buttons and buttonholes. Again, this is a 20mm button, and I have 3 of them to attach. I tested my buttonhole and it works, so I'll finish up the closures and get it pressed and show it off. I'm really happy with the final outcome and feel like the silhouette and fabric choice is great for me. I wanted it to be versatile enough to wear it with most colors, and the drape of this brushed cotton twill works so great for this pattern. If you would also like to make this variation, you can download the template for free from our website. There's a link in the description below to a page on our website where you can find all the info necessary to recreate this swing coat variation.